We have a couple questions that came in this week that I believe Carol's going to ask us.
You are right. We have two questions related to thoughts. So the first question is, if you can't stop the thought and the sacred word doesn't work, what do you do? The thought gets louder and louder. Sometimes it sounds like a battle. Screaming the sacred word to drown out the thought is no feather on a cloud. Help me.
Excellent question, and I can really relate to this one. So when you start to quiet down, you normally become aware of all those thoughts that are swarming around, and you may really feel barraged by them. So our imagination's just in perpetual motion. It's always grinding out images of some kind. So these thoughts are normal. And one of the most helpful things is just to accept that they're going to be there. You're going to expect them, accept them, and then that way we don't get so upset by them. So it's important to remember that thoughts are integral, inevitable, and a normal part of centering prayer. You're not trying to get rid of your thoughts that come up. Instead, you let them come, you let them go by. And the sacred word is introduced not to get rid of the thoughts, but to return to our intention to consent to God's presence and action within. So once we get comfortable with thoughts are not only inevitable and normal, they're part of the healing process and the growth initiated by God in our prayer. So once we get comfortable with that fact, we can treat them very friendly and not as something that we're trying to fight, because we don't fight anything in this prayer. So progress in centering prayer leads to just detaching from thoughts. It's not eliminating the thoughts. And just remember, every time we return to our sacred word is an act of love.
So the next question on thoughts. I sit for 20 minutes twice a day. My intention is to consent to God's presence and action. I have my sacred word. What I do not know, I always have thoughts. I usually do not engage. I do not resist them. So that means I say the sacred word nonstop?
Another excellent question. So as long as thoughts are coming by and going along on their own accord, you don't have to use your sacred word. In the beginning, it might be helpful to return to the sacred word just to really make it a part of our heart and our being. And then we'll be more comfortable and it'll be easier to use it when the need arises. But as long as the thoughts are going by, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to introduce your sacred word. But during the time of centering prayer, our sacred word may become vague or disappear altogether. So these questions on thoughts are so good. We really appreciate hearing the questions. Today's video, The Discipline of Centering Prayer, is really going to address thoughts in more detail. So I think you'll really appreciate the video today to help clarify any questions you do have. So thanks, Carol, for those questions and the people who submitted them.
You're welcome.
Before we go into our centering prayer today, I'd like to just spend a moment to review the method of centering prayer. So some people, if you happen to be new today, this may be new to you, we welcome you to listen. And for those of you who have been doing this prayer for a little bit or a long time, it's always just so valuable to go through the method. So number one, choose a sacred word as the symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. 2, sitting comfortably and with eyes closed, settle briefly and silently introduce the sacred word as the symbol of your consent to God's presence and action within. And 3, when engaged with your thoughts, return ever so gently to the sacred word. And 4, at the end of the prayer period, remain in silence with eyes closed for a couple of minutes. So now I invite Stephen Garrett, who will be leading us in our time of centering prayer.
Hello, everyone. We will be continuing with 20 minutes of our centering prayer practice. And what I will be doing is ringing a meditation bowl 3 times and then share a very brief wisdom saying by Jesus, followed by the ringing of the meditation bowl 1 more time. And then I would invite you to simply rest in God's presence using the centering prayer practice. And after 20 minutes, I will ring the bowl 1 more time. And then I would invite you to simply just continue sitting with your eyes closed for a couple of more minutes before opening them, and before we go on to the next portion of our program this morning. So I would invite you to find, if you haven't already, a sitting position that feels right for you, and to close your eyes. And we will begin in just a moment. Jesus said, "But when you pray, enter into your private room, and having closed your door, pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who watches what is secret will reward you." When you feel ready, please open your eyes.
Thank you, Stephen, for leading us in our centering prayer. I'd just like to invite you to listen to this video just with your heart. Let it soak in and see if there isn't just one concept, one thing that just really seems to be speaking to your heart today in a special way.
The last time we spoke, we emphasized the relationship that with God that is taking place in this private room, especially when we're learning to pray in secret which seems to be the place where God can be most found. In this talk, let's look at centering prayer from a disciplinary point of view. That is to say, how does the proper practice of centering prayer further the relationship? Of course, the discipline of centering prayer is not an end in itself. It's totally in the service of deepening the relationship and moving it from conversation to communion, from active form of prayer to a very receptive form of prayer. So here goes. First of all, once we get into our private room and have closed the door and bolted it if necessary, and have taken a position where we won't have to think of ourselves or how uncomfortable we are, and have turned our intention as well as our general loving attention to God's presence and action within us, to which we consent, and are just being there with the whole of our being, giving our complete presence to God. We're offering ourselves, like that couple I spoke of in the last tape, completely to God. Here I am. We're waiting for God. We're not doing anything except maintaining our original intention to consent to God's presence and action. And so in this prayer, and any kind of analysis of what's going on is totally inappropriate. This is not a research project. And when you're entering into an intimate conversation, especially into communion with someone, it's not the time to analyze your feelings or your psychological state. If you feel love, you feel love. You don't have to talk about it, analyze it, or look it up in the dictionary. So no analysis of what's going on in the prayer, such as, am I entering into the night of sense, perhaps? Or do all these thoughts indicate this is not meant for me? All that is baloney, is to be disregarded. No analysis of any kind. Secondly, there should be no expectations of any kind, that something great is going to happen. The greatest thing that can happen is already happening, namely the divine Holy Trinity, the divine indwelling is present within us and totally available to us, giving us his complete presence, attention, as if we were, so to speak, the only thing in all creation. And so the problem is in how present we are to this presence. And hence, our expectations get in the way of being present because they involve the future. Expectations belong to what's to come, into the future, whereas consent refers to the present moment. And the present moment with God's full presence is what is. And so to find God fully, we too have to gradually lure ourselves, so to speak, into the present moment too. And prayer in secret greatly helps that project. So the urgency or the compulsion or the habit or the addiction of thinking of ourselves in some way, do I like this or don't I like this? Do I want more or do I want less? Am I doing okay or am I making a mistake? All of that is for the birds. I mean, it doesn't belong at this level of communion and intimacy. It's like being in the arms of God. What more do you want, for heaven's sake? It's like a kiss. Somebody is kissing you. It's not the time to talk about the weather. In fact, it's not the time to talk about anything. Otherwise, you'll miss some of the intimacy of the kiss, I would suspect. in any case, no expectations. And finally, there should be no goals, aims, or purposes. Love doesn't have purposes. Love is its own excuse for being. Love is its own reward, as St. Bernard says in one of his books. You don't need anything else if you've got love, especially in the moments when you are, in fact, experiencing being loved. That's the time to receive it and not to say anything. And so utter silence is the proper attitude in the private room, of which, as we've said, centering prayer is simply a how-to method appropriate to our time. Now, there are other goals that we might have, such as repeating the sacred symbol we've chosen, which is usually the sacred word that you've chosen in a period of silent prayer, asking the Spirit to suggest something. It's not so much the word, as we've said before, and its content that's important, but rather its capacity simply to express your intention to spend this time with God, to be in communion with God, to be totally open and available and present to God. And so we recommend a certain discretion in the way that you use the sacred word. It doesn't have to be repeated non-stop. The discreet use of the sacred word means that you use it when you need it. And when you need it is when other thoughts or perceptions come down the stream of consciousness. Let me remind you that in the contents of centering prayer, thoughts mean any perception whatsoever, such as memories, plans, external sensations, interior sensations, concepts, emotions, memories. Any particular concept, whether sensible, mental, or spiritual, is a thought in the terminology that we use in centering prayer. So some thoughts, of course, we're indifferent to. They're just the inevitable passage of our imagination from one thing to another. And so we have to have a friendly attitude towards thoughts in general, which is very different from getting involved with the thoughts. We resist no thought. We hang on to no thought. We react emotionally to no thought. And we return to the sacred word when you notice you're getting interested, either by attraction or by aversion, with any particular thought or perception. Now, I should mention here that there is a method called mantric prayer that appears both in the Eastern religions and in some degree in the Christian tradition, especially the Jesus prayer, which is repeated again and again, sometimes with a word, sometimes without it, and sometimes with certain breathing practices that accompany it, and sometimes without it. So a kind of prayer, mantric prayer, in which you continually say the same word again and again, is a distinct practice from centering prayer. It's a good one. We don't claim that centering prayer is the only one, but we suggest that it's a suitable one, considering the human condition at the end of the millennium. And we offer it to you to try. We don't obviously insist that you do it. This is one method of engaging with the divine presence in the inner room. That's the essence. However you get there, that's the essence. But a centering prayer, it does not require the constant repetition of the sacred word or of some other sacred symbol. We've mentioned the sacred gaze, and we've mentioned the sacred breath, which is not following the breath, which would be a perception, but simply noticing very casually that you're breathing when some thought that attracts your attention, gets to be center stage in your interior awareness. But in the beginning, because we have such a habit of thinking and the interior dialogue is so well established that you can't think of life without it, you have to return again and again to the sacred word, which is as you remember, simply a reaffirmation of the original intention you had when you started the centering prayer and sat down in your inner room, having closed the door, supposedly on thoughts. But the thoughts have a way of getting in anyway. They don't respect doors, windows, or bolts. So when an attractive thought comes down, then we return to the sacred word. In the beginning, you may have to say the sacred word almost constantly to maintain that intention because of the bombardment of our ordinary thinking apparatus. But you don't say it with impatience. You say it ever so gently to emphasize that you don't have a negative attitude towards these thoughts, because that will not help. The thoughts are inevitable. It's our attitude to the thoughts, not having no thoughts, that is the sign of progress. And the proper attitude is to let them all go by without paying attention to them at all. Now, that capacity is going to take time to establish as a habit, and since we've established the other habit for the past 10, 20, 30, 40, and whatever years, it's going to take a few weeks, months, to get this new capacity to be detached inwardly or to be free inwardly from following the more or less interesting thoughts that may come down the stream of consciousness as we are waiting with the Lord with the intention of consenting presence to his presence and action within us. A second goal that we should avoid is the naive hope of having no thoughts. There is a time in centering prayer where there may not be thoughts, but it's very brief, and it requires the Spirit suspending our rational faculties so that they can't think, or the imagination can't produce images. But this is in the mystical Christian tradition is considered to be rather rare. St. Teresa thinks it only lasts maybe half an hour at most. Although it's worth saying that in the 13th century mystics of the Beguine tradition, which was incidentally a lay movement, they seem to have had ecstasies or this suspension of their thinking faculties for hours at a time, and even for 3 or 4 days. Again, this is not necessarily something to be desired, it's just something that can happen. The essence is not our experience of centering prayer, but our fidelity to the regular practice, which leads to the change of our attitudes in daily life. So in one sense, the centering prayer practice and contemplative prayer into which it leads is a preparation for action or for daily life, where you might say the real battle for transformation and union with God takes place. I said it was naive to think of having no thoughts. If you actually had no thoughts, you could be dead. Because one of the signs of life is the capacity to think. So we mustn't have a negative idea of thinking as though it was a disaster or bad. It's one of the greatest triumphs of evolution up to this point, to have the universe become conscious of itself through the reflection of human beings. The point is, it's not the end of the journey. It's not the greatest faculty. And it's a hindrance when we are trying to relate to God at a deeper level than thinking, which is the spiritual level of our being, and to relate to the divine presence, which is at an even deeper level. The divine presence is the source from which our being arises at every level, physical, mental, and spiritual, at every microsecond. So we welcome the thoughts, but not with attachment. We welcome them in the sense of paying no attention to them. No thought can prevent this prayer from going by unless we get interested in it and consent to it. And it's the consent to the thought or perception that subtly draws us out of our basic intention that requires us to renew our original intention to be in God's presence and to consent to his action. Similarly, a third point that would be, some people make as a goal, which would be a mistake, is by means of the sacred word or the sacred symbol to make the mind a blank. This would not be healthy or a help. The mind is not meant to be a blank. It is and the emptying of thoughts is not with the purpose of not having any thoughts at all. The purpose is always to be detached from the thoughts and be able to maintain our intent to consent to God's presence throughout the prayer. Hence it's a very receptive kind of preparation for contemplative prayer. Notice I said preparation. I might just add here that centering prayer is not strictly contemplative prayer in the sense of St. John of the Cross and other authors who always have taught that contemplative prayer is a sheer gift. What it is a preparation by reducing the obstacles and helping our listening apparatus to be sensitive to the subtle movements of the Spirit, which, remember, are taking place in secret, that is, in utter silence. We can't perceive them directly, except when grace is especially strong, but that's always temporary. And our goal is not for some temporary satisfaction, but for the permanent state of transformation in which our presence and awareness to God's presence becomes a part of our everyday awareness, without interfering with the practical details of daily life, so that one can cook breakfast and pick up the children at the school and whatever else your occupations are, without your being distracted in any way from the effectiveness of your activity, while at the same time the presence of God is subtly present as a kind of ever-present awareness, without your being able to do anything about it. And the deeper that awareness becomes, the less you can get away from it, even if you tried. It becomes a part of oneself in everyday life. A fourth goal that we should avoid is feeling sensible consolation. Well, every now and then the pleasure of centering prayer predominates in the prayer. And it predominates precisely because the movement of the contemplative gifts of the Spirit have touched us, or God has grasped our will that we have been offering or surrendering to him. And now there's a sense of God's presence, a sense of peace, a sense of coming home. that can overflow into the senses and make your heart beat faster. It can even have a slightly erotic a feeling. A great desire for God. You mustn't think of erotic love in terms of genital activity merely, but eros refers to the whole gamut of pleasure that is designed by God to be a stepping stone to God. Unfortunately, with the false self system, pleasure has become for many people a substitute for God. But occasional pleasure in prayer helps to orientate us into where we're going. It helps concentration, perhaps more than anything else. Emotional involvement in the prayer is a great source of concentration. But you can't count on it. Hence, it's useless to make it a goal. And you don't, and as you deepen in the spiritual life, you no longer need sensible consolation. And in fact, there's a disinclination for it because it preoccupies one's attention from the refinements of pure love, from the refinements of God's presence. But I would never suggest trying to resist the pleasure of sensible consolation, because it may be that our particular psychological history needs this kind of affirmation from God to heal the deep wounds that we might have brought from early childhood, such as a feeling of rejection. Many people in our culture have a low self-image, and I think God, one of the purposes of divine consolation, especially of a sensible kind, is to provide what some people were denied, an embrace that really meant love, a fondling, and that an infant needs, a sense of belonging, a sense of being wanted, a sense of being loved. Actually, for human beings, only love, genuine love, brings us into full human being. Otherwise, there's always a doubt somewhere in our psyche as to whether being alive or being a human being is such a hot idea. So God provides in the spiritual journey in remarkable ways for whatever was missing. Maybe not completely if the privation was very serious, but that's the reason why we don't resist the feeling of sensible consolation, but we don't put it before us as a goal, so that when it doesn't happen, we begin to get edgy and irritable and say to ourselves, well, if God is going to treat me this way, he can forget it. I'm not coming to pray anymore. And so people can be very childish in their relations to God, and also there's a tendency to project onto God how we would feel if a human person treated us this way. So like if you're making friends with someone and you reach a certain point of intimacy, if they take a long trip without telling you, or they pay no attention to you for a while, or they seem to be more interested in somebody else for a while, you get jealous and you figure of them as other people in the world. If I put my investment in this guy or this gal. And so we do the same with God. In other words, if you get attached to sensible consolation, then you say, well, tit for tat. If God doesn't console me, he can't expect me to show up here at great cost to myself twice a day. In any case, there's a fifth goal that some people have, which is similar to this, and that is having a spiritual experience of some kind. It's just a little different because spiritual experience can be purely spiritual. It's much more profound and much more unifying. It goes much deeper than sensible experience, although on occasion it can overflow into the senses. But its source, as St. Teresa describes it in the Interior Castle, comes from a much deeper place. It's much more substantial, and it's much more transforming. It orientates us to the spiritual relation to God, which is ultimately the one that we have to settle for, and indeed is far beyond sensible consolation in its effects. So We might find then, in our centering prayer practice, or distinguish in general 3 tracks. There's the ordinary psychological awareness that we bring with us into the private room and deliberately let go of with an intent of our will to be in the presence of God during this time. Then thoughts come down the stream of consciousness, inevitably. We pay no attention to them insofar as we can. But most of the time, especially in the beginning, they pay so much attention to us that they set off and are conscious, and remember we have an unconscious level of motivation too. The desires for affection, esteem, power, control, and security and survival that are the instinctual needs of early childhood that all of us depend on for pleasure or happiness in the beginning of our lives, and hence are deeply rooted as projects. So if some thought comes down that touches one of those drives or projects with some symbol in the culture, that then they get activated, and then you get interested in the thought, and you hop on the boat, if that's what we could call these thoughts or perceptions, and you're carried downstream completely out of your intention, and you just have to start again. And remember, we always say, whenever you notice you're thinking about another thought, just get off the boat. Start over without the least self-recrimination or disappointment. It's just the way it is, and it's going to take time to establish the habit. After a while, after returning to the sacred word again and again and again, which is always an act of love, hence if you spend 19 and a half minutes of the 20-minute period returning to the sacred word, it's still a wonderful prayer because you've made perhaps thousands of acts of love. And charity, God's love, grows in us by the repetition of acts, like faith and hope, the other 2 theological virtues. But this 3rd track may arise in which, in somewhere in the middle of the prayer, you become aware that you're not interested in any thoughts. And that means that the contemplative gifts have touched you at a deep level and have grasped your will, even though not firmly, even though not completely. And so you're aware that you're not interested in the thoughts that come down the stream of conscience. In that situation, you can simply rest in the presence of God. You don't need to return to the sacred symbol because you're already in the place where the sacred symbol is designed to take you, which is complete disregard of the thoughts that are going by. Hence, in centering prayer, intention is the main focus of our practice.